Well, last time we left off, it was 1739, and George Whitefield had just arrived. He was in Philadelphia, and we have the beginning of the Great Awakening. And as we think of the Great Awakening, I want you to think in terms of a sort of taxonomy of some of the major figures that were part of it. Of course, we have the champions of the Great Awakening, and that would be our very own Jonathan Edwards, of course, and then it would be England's George Whitefield. But as the case with some of these things, you have folks who go to one extreme or the other. And so we have those who took the Awakening's emphases to a far extreme, and we'll call them the Fanatics. And among the Fanatics is a very colorful figure, James Davenport. But we also have the other side of the spectrum. And so while we have the Fanatics, we also have, and we'll try to squeeze this in here, we have the Detractors. And the key, or sort of most significant of the Detractors, is Boston's Charles Chauncey. Well, let's talk about James Davenport. James Davenport was also part of New England royalty. His great-grandfather, was one of the founders of the New Haven colony, and that, of course, went on to be the colony of Connecticut. He was Yale trained, and right around 1741, he began itinerant preaching. And from 1741 to 1743, he was very actively involved in itinerant preaching and was a bit of an agitator. He liked to sort of stir things up. He liked to create problems. And in many instances, he found himself uninvited from towns. But he'd show up anyway, and he'd speak, and he'd often get arrested. And of course, that just fueled him on to be even more cranky, and he would go on to the next town. Well, all of this culminated in 1743. He shows up in the town of New London, Connecticut. And of course, all the churches are shut to him, so he's not able to preach from those pulpits. But he goes out into the street. And here's where things get a little bit fanatical, because he starts sponsoring a book burning. So he has the residents bring their books, and some of these are books by good New England Puritans. These are solid books that they're bringing and just sort of throwing in, because all of these are a distraction from the pure Word of God. And there's too much learning, and there's too much book learning going on, and we need more of the freedom of the Spirit and the zeal of the Spirit. So he has this book burning. And while you're at it, why not go ahead and sort of throw in those trappings of wealth as well? So remember we had talked about Jonathan Edwards' good wig that he had? Well, people started bringing their good wigs, and they start throwing their wigs into the fire. And they throw their jewelry into the fire. And James Davenport himself offers up, and I will quote this, his plush breeches, quote unquote. So apparently these were rather, I guess we would say, fancy pants that Davenport throws into the fire. Well, of course, for that, he gets arrested too. Well, a year later, after all this time in prison, he's thought through his ways, and Davenport publishes his Detractions, where he recants of his ways, recants of his exuberant enthusiasm, and he also acknowledges that he might have had underlying conditions that contributed to things. And I will quote him now. He claims that he was malaffected by, quote, a long fever, and he was also malaffected by a cankery humor. Now, I'm not exactly sure medically what that was, but it was something that affected our poor friend, James Davenport. But the reality is, what happened with the Fanatics, and you see this all the time in church history, don't you? It's the pendulum swing. So as one group pushes the pendulum to one extreme, that pendulum is going to go back to the other extreme. And so now we enter Charles Chauncey. Charles Chauncey is also New England royalty. His grandfather, same name, Charles Chauncey, was the second president of Harvard. Charles Chauncey himself was a minister in Boston, and he took it upon himself to undertake a 300-mile tour of New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts to chronicle what he could of the revivals and of the awakening. He published this as a book in 1743 entitled Seasonable Thoughts on the State of Religion in New England. And essentially, the book is a chronicle of the worst of times of the Second Great Awakening. And if he was looking for fanatical expressions, he could find them, cataloged them all in the book, and published it as a way to diminish and detract from the Great Awakening. And so the Great Awakening had its fanatics and it had its enemies, and neither were true friends of the awakening. Well, let's take a look at the champions of the awakening, and we'll go back to Jonathan Edwards. We had talked about him briefly before, but he's always worth discussing. I think what we see in Edwards is not simply the sort of emphasis that we want to pick up of the Great Awakening, but we see in Edwards that desire, once again, to hold on to that nature of what constitutes Puritanism, which is to say, to hold on to that notion of a confessional affirmation that will lead to conviction, that will lead to the church being the church in culture, and not simply the church being part and absorbed by and accommodated to the culture. So we already mentioned the revivals back in 34 and 35, mentioned his first book, a faithful narrative of a surprising work of God. But then we've got to fast forward to 1741. And in 1741, he's traveling from Northampton, Massachusetts, on the Connecticut River, just a little bit above the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. He travels down to the town of Enfield, Connecticut, still along the Connecticut River Valley, and he goes there to hear a sermon. It was in the middle of the week. There were a number of ministers that were going to converge there to discuss the events of the awakening, and there was also going to be preaching there. Well, the minister who was assigned to preach that night had traveled by horseback to get there, and he traveled through the rain, and by the time he got there, he was not feeling well at all and in no condition to preach. And so this group of ministers is standing around, right? And they're sort of drawing straws almost to see who's going to get up there to preach. And Edwards says, well, I have this sermon in my saddlebag, so I'll go ahead and preach. He had preached the sermon at Northampton. And he thought it was a really good sermon. He thought that it had a strong emphasis to it. But it wasn't that it was poorly received by his congregation, but it just sort of was preached and that was it. But he thought this potentially could be something that could be published. And so he brought it along, the manuscript, presumably that if he found some spare time, he could work on editing it and preparing it for publication. Well, he steps into the pulpit there in 1741 in Enfield, and he begins preaching. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the biblical text that Edwards picked for this sermon. The text is Deuteronomy chapter 32. It's the Song of Moses. It's the second Song of Moses in the Pentateuch. The first one goes back to Exodus 15 and is the victory song of the Exodus. But this is a little bit of a different song in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Probably the best way you could describe it, it's a warning song. It's a song that celebrates the covenant that Israel has with God. But the majority of it is devoted to warning Israel not to break covenant. Moses was a good student of human nature. Moses anticipated what Israel was going to do when it made it into the land, that it may very well forget God. Forget the God who brought them out of Egypt. Forget the God who was bringing them into the promised land. Forget the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so this Song of Moses is very much a warning song. At verse 5 of chapter 32, we read, "They have dealt corruptly with him," meaning God. "They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation." So rather than staying on that straight path of the covenant, they've strayed from it. We learn, but, verse 9, "But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage." In other words, God is faithful to his covenant. God is faithful to his people. But it's his people who are betraying him and unfaithful to him. Verse 20 declares at the end of the verse, "Children in whom there is no faithfulness." There's no faithfulness to the covenant. And then we come to this verse in verse 35. "Vengeance is mine," God says, "and recompense, for the time when their foot shall slip. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly." Now that's the English Standard Version. The King James Version reads that line about their foot slipping. The King James reads, "Their foot shall slide in due time." Now, Edwards chose that. It's not even a verse. Edwards chose that line for his sermon. And that line becomes not just a proof text. You've got to put that line in the context of what's happening here in Deuteronomy chapter 32. And what is happening here is this discussion of the covenant and covenant faithfulness. Now, remember when we talked about Puritanism and we talked about their beliefs? And one of the beliefs that we stressed was the covenant and that covenant relationship with God. So here we are. Here's what Edwards is doing. So you see what he's doing in the sermon. He's saying, we are the covenant people of God. We've had all these benefits of having the blessings of God's covenant. And here we are betraying him. And we go on almost anesthetized to our condition. Because we're all buttoned up and we're living in our nice houses and we have all of our things that we have and we're a few generations down and we've got these wonderful towns that we all live in and we're such accomplished people. But their foot shall slide in due time. Totally unaware of the spiritual condition of their souls. Totally unaware of the eternal consequences of their actions. That's what is on Edwards' mind as he's thinking about this text. And he uses this text to preach the most famous sermon in all of American history, and you know exactly which one it is, before I even say it, "Sinners in the hands of an angry God." And they're going about their business thinking all is well, and meanwhile, their foot shall slide in due time. Do you see the drama of it? And do you see how Edwards is injecting all of that drama of the covenant into this sermon and into a warning shot for the people listening to the sermon? At one point in the sermon, he's going to say, the bow of God's wrath is bent, and his arrow is pointed directly at us. I mean, it's a powerful image. You can see the archer with the bow ready to go. And he'll also talk about being a spider dangling over the pit of hell. And it's by the mere pleasure of God that we are dangling there. This is a powerful sermon. It's one of the most powerful sermons probably ever preached. And as he preached it in Enfield in 1741, it had a total opposite effect of sort of a nonplussed effect up in Northampton. At that congregation in Enfield, the Spirit was at work, and people started crying out for the state of their souls. But here's the interesting thing. As we're going to see in revivalists to come and revivalisms to come, Edwards doesn't keep them whooped up. Right? At that point, as the congregation is getting active and expressing themselves, he could easily just keep pushing them into a frenzy. He does the opposite. As they get increasingly exercised, he stops talking. He gives them time to compose themselves. Because what Edwards wanted to do was not land some kind of temporary, emotive expression, but instead he wanted to penetrate to their very hearts and let the ideas that he was presenting, as dramatically as he was presenting them, but let the ideas, and more importantly, let the truth of the gospel do its work. And so as the crowd would get exercised, Edwards would actually stop talking. And there was nothing really dramatic about Edwards' presentation. In fact, an eyewitness there at Enfield says that he never even made eye contact with the people in the congregation, that instead he stared at the bell rope as if to drill a hole through it, right? So partly, believe it or not, that was an acoustic technique. So if you wanted your voice to carry over a congregation, you would identify a place above them, right, and speak to it so your voice would carry. If I'm looking at you, my voice is going to go straight down, right, in one of these large congregations. But it was also because, again, Edwards wanted the weight of the sermon to land on the people's hearts, not the drama of his presentation, not the package that the truth was coming in. And so that sermon had its effect, sinners in the hands of an angry God. If you go to Enfield, Connecticut now, you'll not find the church that Edwards preached in. It burned down, fell down, something. I think the church there in Enfield is like the 6th church building built since Edwards preached there. But on the site where the church was, there's a rock right along the side of the road. And on the rock, there's a plaque saying, at this space or at this place in 1741, Edwards preached, sinners in the hands of an angry God. It was a sermon in a context, a sermon reminding the New England Puritans of their identity as the covenant people of God. And just like an Old Testament prophet, Edwards was calling them back, calling them from their twisted ways and back to the God of the covenant. Well, that was Edwards. He was a powerful preacher. I think the genius of Edwards was that he was able to combine head and heart. Edwards, when he would preach a sermon, he would give the text and he would give the doctrine. It's a typical Puritan thing, read the text, exposit a little bit, give a doctrine, and then expound the doctrine. And you usually gave reasons for the doctrine. Edwards would always give 2 sets of reasons. 'Tis rational, he would say, right? It is rational. 'Tis rational to believe this. And 'tis biblical to believe this. See, those weren't opposing categories for him. But neither was rationality and true affection, true passion for the truth. And what was happening on a lot of the detractors was that they had turned Christianity into a purely rational enterprise, almost devoid of its soul. And what was happening with the Fanatics was they were forgetting the head part. They were forgetting the truth part. They were forgetting the confessional part. They were burning books because it was all about the exuberance, the enthusiasm, the emotional expression. And I think, again, the genius of Edwards was that this was the mind on fire. This was an impassioned intellect. And in one sense, this is very much at the heart of the Reformed tradition that we don't often talk about. You go to Calvin's Institutes, and one of the things that Calvin says is a saving knowledge of God is a sensus suavitatis, which means a sense of sweetness. Isn't that a beautiful expression? In Edwards, he picks up on that and uses the word relish. Now, we're Americans, and that's what we do at baseball games. We put relish on hot dogs. That's not what Edwards is talking about. He's talking about the psalmist desiring the sweetness of the honeycomb, the sweetness of God. And you see that in Edwards. The other person you see it in is the other champion, George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield had a couple of sermons that he would return to again and again. One of them was called The Almost Christian. Now, John Wesley preached the same sermon, not sure which one preached it first, and we mentioned this back when we talked about the halfway Christianity. As a halfway Christianity is not Christianity, the almost Christian is not a Christian. And so George Whitefield would preach on the almost Christian sermon, and the other sermon he loved to preach is very simply, you must be born again. And the emphasis of Whitefield was on regeneration. And he preached regeneration just as Jesus approached Nicodemus approached Jesus, and Jesus told him, you must be born again. That was the mission of Whitefield. And so between the theologian and pastor of the Reformation, and between the revivalist and itinerant and preacher of the Reformation, or of the Awakening, Whitefield, we have the First Great Awakening as a significant colonial event. Now, if we take a step back from the American church and look at American culture, we can see a very significant thing happening here. One of the things that the Awakening does for American culture is that it brings for the first time a sense of a unified colonial identity. Prior to the Great Awakening, the sense was, I'm of Massachusetts, or I'm of Colony, or of Connecticut rather, or I'm of New Jersey, or I'm of Pennsylvania. But now we have a unified experience and a shared experience through these revivals. The other thing is there were a lot of newspapers and publications that were popping up. And people for the first time were very much aware of each other, not just consumed with what was happening in Boston, but here are people in Massachusetts reading about what's happening down in Georgia. And so one church historian, Alan Hemert, and we call this the Hemert thesis, is going to say that the Great Awakening lays the groundwork for what we'll see in the American Revolution, with a sense of an American identity for the first time, and also publications that facilitated communication up and down the colonies and among the colonies. The other thing we see, though, is the impact on the church, not just the impact on culture. We see churches started all over these areas where the revivalists preach. Churches were started. I remember not too far from where we used to live in Pennsylvania, this small town out of the way, about an hour outside of Philadelphia. Whitefield preached in an oak grove there to 20,000 people. And I don't think the population of the two counties combined was 20,000 people. So they came from everywhere. And as a result of that, there was a church established there in that town that is thriving to this day. And that happened all over these places where Whitefield preached. And not only were these churches established, but historians estimate anywhere between 50,000 to 70,000 people came to Christ through these revivals, the First Great Awakening from 1739 to 1745. Well, that was a very exciting moment in American colonial history and in American Christianity. And when we come back next time, we're going to look at some of the aftermath of this First Great Awakening and its impact on both the church and its impact on American culture.